Hello and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and I'm very excited today to have a friend with me who is also one of the leading psychologists in the area of mindset. She has extensive training and experience in the psychology of human behavior and dispute resolution. So I think you can see why she's going to be a wonderful guest for us to have here on the Learn to Mediate online podcast. Her name is Dr. Debra Dupree, and I have known Debra for a few years now. She is located in San Diego, California, where you all know I was happy to live for a couple of years, and now I've moved off to Chicago, but we have stayed in touch, and in fact, we've spoken on some panels together, and Debra is really one of those individuals who impresses you with just the vast breadth of her knowledge. She has for years, she is herself a mediator. She's done both family law as well as workplace mediations, but she's also was a mediation trainer for 5 years and is now a master mediator and actually oversees other mediators and mentors them, and then speaks. I mean, Debra, how you speak so many times per year. I bet you can't count how many times that is at different conferences and events.
Well, I did try to make a list not too long ago, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is really long.
I mean, we have been, we just last year were on 2 or 3 panels together, and on different topics. And that's what I love, because Debra truly has like a breadth of knowledge about our industry, but all, dispute resolution. She's one of us, but also she layers in the psychological components, which frankly are a challenge for a lot of us who are perhaps from the legal field or from other fields. And she has a new program actually coming out shortly that's for those lawyers out there, including me, and I'll tell you my experience when we get a little further in. But the reason I asked her to join us today is because so many of you reach out to me asking me questions about creating emotional bonds, about creating rapport, about handling emotions as affected by the online platform. And so I really thought Debra is perfectly situated. By the way, she is an online mediator as well and has been conducting mediations online, if not as long as I have, I think even longer. So truly, this is going to be, I think, enlightening for all of you. So let me just first say thank you so much for joining us, Debra.
Thank you, Susan, for having me. As you know, you were on my podcast last year, and so nice to be able to return the favor.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to have you here today. I announced that you were coming in this past week's podcast, and I've already been receiving emails from people saying, oh, could you ask her this? Could you ask her that? So one thing I want everyone to know, I'm going to have all of Debra's contact information in the show notes. So if we don't get to all of your questions, I know Debra, you can reach out to her. She is truly one of those professionals who is there to support the profession. So we'll have all of her information. But I do want to, let's start out with these questions that I get. You and I were talking the other day, and I mentioned in the past couple of months, I have held webinar trainings for more than 15,000 participants.
Wow.
Yes, I mean, which is wonderful. I love that mediators and professionals are wanting to be trained in online mediation and doing this, what we do, and doing it well online. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you, I think besides questions about breakout rooms, I think the number one question I get is don't you lose something emotionally with the online, and how do you create rapport because you're separated by a screen now, you're not in the same room? So I would just I just want to turn it over to you. What do you have to say about that?
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to weigh in on this. one of the things that I really emphasize in all the training I do and communications is that how important it is to, have a conversation up front. And so, I've talked about this, I really start with the pre-mediation opportunity to have that voice-to-voice connection and to, I think the question that oftentimes gets missed by a lot of mediators is simply starting off with what's important to you about this matter. What are your concerns, your fears, so forth. And so when I teach mediators, how to mediate, I use an iceberg model, right? We all know the tip of the iceberg, right? And so what I have learned over my years of being a psychologist and in communications and mediation is that often people react to what's the tip of the iceberg. They react to what they hear, what they see, and what's being said. But they seldom dive deeper into that bigger part of the iceberg below the waterline to what we call the beach, the beliefs, the expectations, assumptions, attitude, concerns or hopes, not to mention the fibbings, the fears, values, and needs. And so by saying what's important to you, that's that big, broad opening question. And then it's learning what I call the art of probing questions, learning how to take it down one layer at a time. And so you can use the pre-mediation by embodying just a couple of these techniques to really sort of understand where's this person coming from, what's important to them. And this is where you really do need to be paying attention to the visual and the audio. If you do the pre-mediation call, it could be by Zoom too, to introduce them to the technology, or simply by phone. But, I don't know if a lot of people know this. I find whenever I speak about this, a lot of people don't. But 55% of how we communicate is by what we see. So paying attention to facial expressions, the eyes, the mouth, just the other day I had a client on, a telehealth call, and if I hadn't been paying really close attention to her, I wouldn't have realized that she had started to cry and was getting very emotional. But I could start to see her chest sort of heave a little bit. I could see, her head was dropping down, and, so just paying attention to those visual clues and making sure that you don't charge forward. And by saying then, keep talking, but it's just that, okay, I just saw a shift. And so I've just said a few things here now, so let me go back and regroup. So 55% of how we communicate is by what we see. So really paying attention to the visuals when you have them is so important. And that's just as true here. I mean, I can see your expression, Susan, your smile, whatever. And, we're still mirroring back and forth. 38% is the tone of our voice. And I know as a mediator, well, I know as a speaker, I have to be very conscious that I tend to have a softer voice, so I have to really project. But it's that soft voice that really helps me connect with people too. Because people oftentimes say you have such a calm, soothing voice, I just feel better already talking to you. So know what your own attributes are and how you can use that. And then only 7% of the actual words that we use. And so it's not that words aren't important, but I put a lot of attention on our languaging. What words are we using? And at least in my training of mediators, is getting away from adjectives. Oh, that must have been really, really difficult. Oh, that sounds like that was difficult for you. Totally different tone gets conveyed. But then when I talk about going below the waterline, that's oftentimes where people don't have conversations. And this is where, again, we can tap into framing our open-ended questions around the beach, the beliefs, the expectations, well, what did you think was going to happen? Well, what's your concern about that? What would be your hope if this is resolved successfully? And all of that really helps people feel that you're listening to them, that you're really hearing what they have to say. So that's sort of the thing that I would start to do, is start using that model, but making sure you do that pre-mediation call, and either Zoom or phone, and then and making sure that you're doing paraphrasing, summarizing sentences with what they've said. They may not know how to articulate it, but that's our job as a mediator, pull it out.
Yeah, I think everything that you said there is so impactful. And there's two things that I, as an online mediation trainer, want people to note. Is one, that probably sounds very much like what many people are doing in their in-person practice, and you just translated it to an online practice. So as something that I've always tried to instill in my trainees is this isn't just some completely different practice because you are now online. It is translating what you did in person and taking it and doing it through an online platform. And the other thing that strikes me about what you said, and I must have gotten, unconsciously, I've been parroting you, I think. I must have heard these statistics from you because everybody who's out there who's heard my presentation knows that I talk about the fact that the vast majority of our communication is through our expression and through the tone of our voice, the intonation in our voice, not the words that we use. And to me, I think that that's actually something, those two, the fact that it's through our visual expression and through the intonation of our voice, because online or virtual mediation is so focused on the face and so audio specific, that I actually think you almost get more information than you might in person because you're less distracted by other things that might be going on. It's very focused. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think there's probably a little bit more prep that you will want to do for your clients when they come into mediation online, because there are some protocols, and I would also suggest that people be aware of their behavioral aspects of how they function so that they can point out, if I could, I would put my hand out to you right now, and say, gosh, I can see that this is painful for you. Or, if I'm going to lean in, I want to make sure that I'm hearing you accurately. And so, I'll give people clues about what I'm going to do. And I'll share this quick little story with you. I learned the hard way in my early days of mediation that, I had a behavior I wasn't even aware that I was doing, although we all do it. You know how we nod our head when we were in agreement with something? I'm
doing it right now. Yes, I know what you're saying.
Yeah. And so in one of my early mediations, I was nodding my head a lot while one party was giving their story. And then I went over here and I was nodding my head a lot. And so then the other party goes, well, you know what? I'm ticked off right now. You just were nodding your head like, in agreement with me. And now you're doing the same thing with her. And that's why we're here, is to resolve this conflict. And I go, oh my gosh. I said, I didn't realize how much I nodded my head. And so I made it a practice for a long time when I opened up a mediation, and I still do this online, that, what's one nonverbal way that people will acknowledge or indicate that they're in agreement? You're nodding your head, right? And so as a mediator, I want to make sure that you know that when I nod my head, it's really about that I'm acknowledging that I'm hearing you. It's not that I'm in agreement with you, because my job as a mediator is to be neutral, to be impartial to both sides. What I'm mediating here is the process between you. And so I just want to be clear, because I know I do that a lot. So I don't want to give you an impression about my behavior that could be erroneous.
That is great. Because first off, the minute you said I nod my head and I saw myself doing it, I think everybody out there is probably, who's listening, is doing the same thing. But one thing you said there that I think is truly impactful, and it really is something that people have said to me, that, in general, we don't touch our clients, but there are times, right, where we would reach out and at least touch someone's hand. And to do that verbally, that's what you did. You described it, if we were together, I would. That's wonderful right there. You're still getting that same impact and comfort or empathy that you're trying to convey. You're not limited by the fact that there is a distance. I actually, when you said it, I felt it. Okay. Even though you weren't even saying it to me, I could feel it in that, in that moment. As a divorce mediator, I'm often with people who are extremely upset and would at times touch someone's arm or, say that. And I could see that being very effective, even though the actual physical touch isn't happening.
Yeah, very much so. And I'll tell you, about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe longer, I was really intrigued about I've got a lot of neuroscience background given my doctorate degree. And so I found that just so fascinating. So I like to always bring a little bit of the neuroscience to it. And I was doing some research for a presentation article I was writing around compassion. And so it took me to the work of Dalai Lama. And so, Dalai Lama basically says, compassion is really nothing more than being warm-hearted. And I always say, even just calling it warm-hearted instead of compassion, I feel warm-hearted, I can feel it myself. And so, for a long time, we've talked about how important it is to show empathy as a surefire way to helping people sort of calm down. And by the way, that showing of empathy is sort of a prelude to what I think we're going to talk about as far as managing emotion. Yep. But acknowledging emotion. And here's the languaging come in. I want to understand how you feel. Say, no, don't say that, because somebody could say, no, you don't. You've never walked in my shoes. You haven't dealt with this, whatever. And so instead of saying I understand, it's like, I want to acknowledge. I can see how upsetting this is for you, rather than say I understand. So using the word acknowledge in some kind of way, or I can see this impacts you. And my mentor, Dr. Dan Dana, who also was not an attorney, but a psychologist, basically said, just comment on what you observe. Okay, so when I saw my client, her behavior shifted, I said, I know we're online here right now, but I can see a shift in your demeanor. I can see a shift in your body language. And so help me understand what's going on for you. And so that was able to redirect her, and even though we were online, she knew, I could tell that she was really getting emotional about what we were talking about. Okay. And so just simply commenting on what you observe is powerful.
Well, and what it also does, it strikes me, is that it lets the other person, the person you're talking to, and you're telling them what you're observing, it's letting them know that even though there's a computer screen between you, you're getting it. Mm-hmm. The emotion is still coming. I always say to people, the emotion still comes through the screen. Trust me, when I've got two people fighting through their computer screen, there's no question as to what's happening there. We know how people are feeling, but that's also, you're communicating to that person that their emotion is very cognizant to you, that you are aware of it, acknowledging it. I love acknowledging. I think that that's a very relevant part. And, so you've sort of taken it through from before the actual mediation. And I do think for the attorneys out there who are listening, as well as mediators, doing that pre-mediation conference with each client is truly important. It is where rapport starts to be built. It's where the clients are able to start to feel comfortable within a process that is probably not very familiar to them, even though it may be familiar to us. And it serves an important part on the practical side of also getting them comfortable with the technology, so that when the actual mediation happens, they can be comfortable with the fact that they have a mediator who understands, that they now feel they know a little bit. So I know and I personally suggest it be on video conferencing. If at all possible, we lose something in a telephonic transmission. We just do. And if your mediation is going to be online, I think you lose an opportunity if you choose not to do it online.
I agree. And there's two things I'd like to come back to. So two things. One is that what I found in my research was around compassion, is that empathy is actually a piece of compassion. And what shifts empathy into compassion, that people can really feel, not just that you're acknowledging, but that you can feel, is to combine that with an act. And so going back to what we're talking about is that, there might be times where you do reach out to your client in a real in-person mediation. But again, you can show that. If I were here, I would reach out and touch you right now. And I just want you to know that I feel your pain, whatever that is. And so I always think about, okay, it's one thing to say it, that's empathy, but it's another thing to do it. And I'll just share with you from a brain perspective, where empathy shows up neurobiologically is still on the side of the brain closer to pain. But when we put an act with it, it shifts that compassion closer to where we feel love. And so there is a biological shift that goes on in our brains when that happens. So that's what I want to say about that. So being really mindful, intentional. And so this goes back to then the pre-mediation, and particularly for our attorneys out there, is to guide them through. And I always like to say, each and every mediator is different, but in general, this is how mediation goes, and actually be able to walk them through, and so they need to understand what the mediation process too, and to make sure that they understand that the mediator is there to facilitate the process to reach resolution, and not to take sides. So sometimes I find people still try to engage the mediator, to shift over to their side. The other thing about that is that would be an attorney's opportunity to sort of acquaint the participant with the online methodology, like the chat room, for example. I was doing a mediation between two parents who had separated, who had a young child, because I do a lot around parent coordination and parenting plans. And I got a chat from the mom saying, "Did you just see him roll his eyes?" and I was focusing on her, but he was over here, and so I didn't realize he was rolling his eyes, and so so I just commented back to her, and I said, well, what I'd like to do is let's take a quick breakout room. I had some questions I'd like to ask each of you, and so I was able to talk to her first and say, what did that mean to you? And then I was able to go back to Dad, where were you coming from? If in fact you actually did that. And so that's the way of using this technology too, that it can be done very quickly just to ask clarifying questions.
Well, and that's a great point, and it sort of segues to the other topic that comes up all the time from my participants, is that they wonder how to manage participant emotions in an online platform. And I'll be honest, I don't understand why it seems different to people, because you're managing emotions in the room. I mean, rarely are we actually like physically holding people apart. Yeah. We're managing emotions in various ways, because there's almost always emotion in the room, but there's a perception that because we're online, this must be very different. And so, but you were just describing actually one way in which I think the online platform actually makes it easier to start to manage emotions. So let's explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I imagine you have experienced this too, but where the tension and the conflict between two parties is so great, they won't be in the same room. And that's what really got me into online mediation quite a few years ago, because I do a lot in the post-divorce world in terms of, like I said, parenting plans and stuff like that. And we all know how ugly that can get. And I oftentimes say, there are some strategies with co-parenting that actually fuel the fire for about 30 to 40% of those getting divorced, that we had to come up with a different way. But that's where, again, not having them in the same room. But I think also with that then is acknowledging emotions going to come up, and be clear in the pre-mediation piece about it. So that, there may be times when you will get emotional, and that's okay. And that's the mediator's job to manage that. And so for those of you mediating, then you better know how to do that. Yeah. And so again, managing the emotion is that by when I start off, I actually say, things will get emotional, things will get intense. And so, to some degree, that's okay. But if I do feel that now it's starting to derail us from the process, I will interject. And I don't want to say intervene, but I will interject to say, hey, this is getting hot. What's going on? What's fueling this fire right now? Maybe this would be an opportunity where we caucus and I have a chance to talk to each of you individually. And just, again, that acknowledgement is huge in terms of bringing down that emotional level, because then the other person feels that you get it. And the other person in the room may actually be reacting. Remember the tip of the iceberg? Yeah. You tend to react to each other. So both people are going up like this. Oh, yeah. And that's where your job is, whoa, let's come on back down. Yep. Yeah. And so just take a deep breath. By the way, deep breathing, I encourage you to use it. We all breathe, but most of the time we're not breathing effectively, particularly when we're in conflict or nervous or whatever. But just, let's just take a deep breath, or two or three. And that will just slow down the heart rate. It will actually slow down the brainwave patterns going on too. They're really charging up. And just, let's just be quiet for a moment. And let's regroup, reflect, and refocus.
The breathing component has been something I worked with a mindfulness instructor when I was creating my family law, my divorce mediation practice, and we incorporated in various different ways mindfulness techniques into the process. And it amazed me how much just simply taking a few deep breaths, how effective that was. And for any of the mediators out there who are rolling your eyes right now, I can feel you through the screen. Yeah, we know you're out there. I'm just going to tell you to try it once, because clients did not react that way. I said, I actually, with a few, would say, I know you're going to think this is a little, woo-woo, but why don't we all just, like, I can feel things are getting a little heated, and maybe if we just all take a deep breath for a moment, and then we're going to talk about this. And remarkably effective. And that is true online or in person. But there's something about online that I wanted to raise and get your opinion on, because I have found, and again, I do family mediation. I know you do a lot of family mediation as well as workplace, which can be very heated as well. I have found that in my online mediations, I am able to keep people together, I'll call in a joint session, longer than I might have been able to do so in person when things do start to get heated. I think most mediators have a knee-jerk reaction that, things are getting heated, it's time to caucus, it's time to separate them. But I have found that people are able to tolerate the discomfort of the high emotion with that space, with that computer screen between them for a longer period of time. And it can then be more effective because they're still interacting, they're still seeing each other, as opposed to now me bouncing back and forth. Have you found that as well?
Yes, absolutely. And in part of that, why I think you're finding that that's possible is that when we're in the same room together, and we're starting to get emotionally intense and heated, for some people, and I have to admit I was one of those in my divorce. I was married to a litigator. That's why I'm not married to him now. I love attorneys, don't get me wrong. But, we got to the point where, it just went in such a negative direction that when I was appalled that here I was, a therapist, a psychologist, and I couldn't manage this better. So it was pretty embarrassing. But I would just get so emotionally intense and physically wound up that I remember running into him outside the bank one day, and that we were like 20 feet away, and we saw each other. It was like we both turned around and sped away, and that was long after the divorce, and so being in the room, you can feel that emotional intensity that becomes unbearable. Your heart rate goes up, your breathing becomes more shallow. And, there are usually 5 different areas of where we tend to feel our intense emotion or stress. And oftentimes it's the stomach, the heart, the lungs, rapid breathing. Sometimes the throat freezes up. And then sometimes we just get, our brains just get flooded with cortisol, which renders us unable to think, and we're just frozen. And so that's important for us as mediators and attorneys to also recognize, where do you react? But that's what's happening for people when they're physically present with each other too. You can just feel it, right?
Oh yeah.
And so by being online like this, we can't feel that heat of that person's physical presence as intensely as what we can't feel it as intensely online as we would if we were in the same room, even across the table from one another.
Yeah. And I've found that, especially, I know mediators are listening from a vast variety of disciplines out there, but high emotion is actually something that I think is a universal in mediation. Certainly not all of the participants. The insurance adjuster is not usually getting all worked up and crying, but the person who was in the accident and the person who's being accused of causing harm, they very well might be very upset. So I think that there's been there are so many tips in here, and I know it's, to use your iceberg, this is the tip of the iceberg. But there's a lot more information on Debra's website, and we're going to get into that. But I want to be sure we talk about your new program that's coming up, because we do have attorneys and mediators listening. And I'm just going to say that when you first told me about this program that you were coming up with, for me, it was one of those moments where you always hear that, like, God, I wish this had existed when I was, doing this. So I had been a litigator, a divorce litigator, and just a truly traditional, go into court, take the facts of the case, and use that to get my client what they want. There's litigation summed up in a nutshell. But I was used to being an advocate who was well paid for my advice. And then I, very luckily found mediation and wanted to make that shift to that kinder, gentler practice, I'll call it. And what didn't shift was my mindset. I found it incredibly difficult to let go of 20 years of being the advice giver and the problem solver. And you are creating a program that addresses that. So please tell us about it and why I wish it had been there 20 years ago or 10 years ago when I made the switch.
Well, I have to admit, I'm sort of wondering, why hadn't I thought about this before, But I'm going to go back and tell just a little bit about my story so our listeners have some foundation for it. I was trained in mediation back in the early 90s, and actually as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act law that passed affecting employees with medical conditions in the workplace. I was already in that space, but I realized I was suddenly having union reps and attorneys show up at my tables with an employee and their supervisors, like, I need more skills. And so that's what got me into mediation. And then during this time, I also had my first and second child. But as I got more, I found mediation. I was like, I love this, And so I'm moving in this space, whereas my husband, the litigator, was still in his space, and our worlds just, kept getting further and further apart. And so, but at that time, like I said, I was in the workplace space, and starting to shift over to family too. But I've spent a lot of my time in the last 20 years taking some of the concepts and things like this that I'm, going to be teaching about in my new workshop to business leaders. And so I've worked with business leaders in how to approach their employees differently, more consciously, more engagingly. And a lot of this was also based on my doctoral dissertation, The Psychology of Good Bosses versus Bad Bosses. So that whole space brought me into emotional intelligence. And so, and I know that the terms of emotional intelligence are sort of passe now, but the principles there, the concepts are still there. And through our mutual colleague, Harold Coleman, he was hearing and seeing what I was doing, and we started collaborating more. So I joke that I've been to more legal conferences in the last 3 years than I have been to psychological conferences. So
I think you have.
Yes, I think I have. Yeah, and all over the country. So it's as I became more, I have to admit, I already had my attitude and bias unconsciously towards attorneys in my mediations, because I often found that they proved to be more challenging than my clients in mediation. And so as I started working more with the mediator community within the legal field, I realized that in my training, and because of my psychological background, I was using a lot of skills that I didn't see mediators with legal backgrounds really using. And so I thought, here I've been teaching this to the business community all this time. And so as I started talking to people like you and Harold and stuff like that, it's like, wow, there could really be a value here. And so that's what the new program, what I've coined, the Agile Lawyer Life, is really incorporating some of these other communication strategies that really can dive deep into your clients' emotions and behaviors, what's important to them, in really pretty quick amounts of time.
Well, and that's what's I think so valuable here. So I think that this program is like for attorneys who want to be mediators, but also if you're going to be an advocate in mediation, or even if you want to be an advocate who's also able to work with your client's emotional content, which is so hard for us. You know, we go to law school for 3 years and get stuff crammed into our heads, all about, you know, what the law is and what the facts are. Nobody in law school that I remember, and I admit I went a very long time ago, and I know there's probably some nice new programs. They honestly didn't even have a mediation program when I went to law school. And I know there's entire ADR programs and masters in dispute resolution now and all kinds of wonderful things. But we're not taught the emotional aspect of all of this and dealing with our clients' emotions and having that agile mindset and being an agile lawyer. So I'm very excited that you're offering this and focusing on the legal profession, not in a way that says we're doing it wrong. It's another set of skills and tools, because at our core, we all, for the most part, I think, got into the legal profession to help people. And if you can't deal with people and their emotions and make that leap to getting ourselves out of our heads sometimes and getting into here and getting into there for them, we're not really helping, or we're not helping as much as we could.
Yeah. Well, you know, Susan, there's two things I'd like to share with you and our listeners is that, as you know, because you're part of the program, I'm interviewing legal professionals who have made that shift into mediation. And it will be released, you know, as a compilation of video interviews for people like those in our audience to learn from. And that is one of the things that's been a consistent theme, is that you know, people like you got into law to help people. And yet, and it's not that you're not, you know, and so, and we also talk about the shift into mediation and the effect it's had on your life. I will go back to, I actually taught ADR at Cal Western School of Law here in San Diego for about 5 years as a non-attorney. And so I remember my first couple of years, and my second and third year law students they go, oh my God, I had no idea there was so much psychology to this process. It's like, duh, you're dealing with people, you know?
There's psychology in people all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can't get away from it.
Can't get away from it. It makes us up. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I actually have a minor in psychology from my undergrad degree, just because I found it very interesting. But I always knew I was going to law school, and I was an English major because I thought, oh, English, I'll have to write stuff. I'll have to be good at that. Comprehension and reading. I tell you, I used the stuff I learned in the psychology much more often, especially when I went into family law, but I think any area of law. So tell us how people can find out about the program and where they can find out more information about you as well.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm really excited too. So first of all, for all of our listeners, I am offering a free webinar coming up this next Friday, June 5th at 12 noon. And so there is a website called theagileLawyerLife.com, and there'll be some information available there. But Susan, you've already mentioned that you're going to make the Zoom link available. Right?
Yes, absolutely. So in the show notes, there'll be the Zoom link that you can just go to register for this free webinar, which I think I'll be registering for. So
great. Yeah. Yeah. And so what I wanted to do then is again, are you at a loss for how to manage emotion, how to connect with your clients? And so I will introduce what I call the power of connection. It's a tool, it's a strategy I developed many years, and I've used almost every setting I go into because it's so powerful in bringing people together. And then just what are some simple strategies that get overlooked? And so I'll be going into a little bit more detail about some of the concepts that we talked about today. And one of the things we didn't get to was moving from unconscious incompetency to unconscious competency. So that's part of what we'll be covering there too. And then just what are some of the ups and downs of working virtually? As we have seen is that there's been more research out there that because people are reporting that they're feeling so much more tired after spending their day in a virtual element. What's going on there? So there is some neurobiological stuff also. And so I've got some tips and strategies about how to manage your time in a mediation, because we all know mediations can get rather lengthy. And yet we've got all this neurobiological stuff going on in our particularly our heads that may not be helpful to reaching resolution.
Right. So definitely information. I mean, all of my listeners, this is right in their wheelhouse. So I encourage everybody to sign up for the free webinar. Can they find out more information about you at theagileLawyerLife.com as well?
Yes, yes, yeah. And just so you know, I'll put a plug out there then, is that I do have a 5-part series that I'm going to go, you know, into deeper components like, you know, how to manage clients in a remote environment and what are some of the tactics that you can use. And so that's just one example, but yeah, 5 parts to sort of break this out even more. And again, bringing to you some of the skills that I've used to teach mediators in the past that, you know, in my world, we've been using for a long time. And so I just think it's time to expand into the legal mediation world.
Well, we're ready for you. I personally have been lucky enough to benefit from your trainings because I've been able to be at all these legal events that you go to, or many of them. And you know, I have such great admiration. You're one of the best trainers that I've ever seen, and speakers. And so I highly encourage everybody. I think you got a taste of that today, folks, but go get more. I'll have all of the information about Debra and about the AgileLawyerLife.com and everything in the show notes. So please, everybody, tune in and go check out more information about Debra. And Debra, thank you so much for taking the time to come today.
Well, thank you, Susan. It's been a real delight, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about what I know.